When you're autistic and you like a neurotypical person, it's gonna have you feeling like Forrest Gump. Anyway, um, I'm still reading the Inheritance Cycle series. I finished the Aragon book in actually I think one day. I might be wrong about that, but I believe I started reading it around 5 a.m. or something, and then before I went to work, which was later at night, I pretty sure I finished it. But it's possible that I had started reading it the day before and I just forgot. Um, but I mean, really enjoyable. Did I make a recording about it already, actually? Because I know I did make one where um, I was talking about it before I actually read any of it. Oh, I did already make an audio of it. I'm think I don't know if I made that audio after finishing it or not. Or yeah, I don't know. But I'm really enjoying it. Um, I noticed once I got to the second book. Also, I'm gonna spoil it probably some of it. Um, when I got to the second book, um, the Rorian chapters come in, and the thing about the Rorian chapters is that they're just better than the Aragon chapters. So you get really into reading one of those. And then it goes back to Aragon, and you're just disappointed, and you're like, oh, now I have to read through this Aragon chapter. And it's not that the stuff that's happening in the Aragon chapter isn't interesting, because it kind of is. It's just that it's nowhere near as fun as the Rorian chapter is. So, um, like if you had an entire book of Aragon chapters like are in this second book, which I think is called Eldest. Yeah. Um, I mean, you wouldn't think it was a bad book. It's just that in comparison with the Roran chapters, it's like, wow, this is really disappointing. And then you can't help but wonder, what it would be like to read the book if the Aragon chapters were as good. I mean, it would probably be like uh, top top 25 books for me if the Aragon chapters were just as good as the Rorian chapters. I don't remember what the rest of the series is like, but there's still two more books after this one, at least in the main series. And I actually ordered the spin-off book about Murtaugh, or Murtagh, I think it might be pronounced actually. Murtagh. I'm not sure. I always thought it was Murtaugh, but I saw in the pronunciation section of the book where it tells you how to pronounce the words, it's pronounced differently than I thought, and I think it is Murtagh, which is weird. But you know, it would be a really good book if the Aragon chapters were just as good. But unfortunately, they actually drag it down, which is such a shame because they're not even bad chapters. And the elf stuff, like where I'm at right now, and that he's learning about the dwarves and the elves basically, and it's actually pretty interesting and fun. And I can't help but compare it to Lord of the Rings because I've always thought that Lord of the Rings was a little overrated. And I am a fan of the Lord of the Rings, but I don't understand when people get downright obsessed with it. And I don't think it's that good. It's got lots of lore, I guess, and people that like learning lore, I guess like it. I don't know. I'm not much of a lore person with anything really. I mean, by like a normal person's standards, I guess I'm a geek, but I don't know. I don't know. I'm not an elite geek, I guess. No, I'm not like a real one. Um, I'm just a bit of a nerd, but if I was like You know how like people will say like Skyrim dragons aren't real dragons because their legs aren't in the right place or something? For me, it's just like if they're calling it a dragon, then it's a dragon, and it doesn't really matter because you know it's fictional creatures, so the anatomy doesn't matter. But it's whatever. Um, where was I? Lord of the Rings. I feel I couldn't help comparing the parts in the Aragon book where they're talking about elves and they're interacting with elves to the parts in Lord of the Rings where they're interacting with elves. Because in Lord of the Rings, it's just kind of written as like, well, the elves were really happy and better than everyone else, and they sang and they were all gay. And that's basically the elves in Lord of the Rings. Um, and it's kind of like that in the Inheritance Cycle too, but they actually do have flaws, and they're like kind of scary. They're a little intimidating actually at different points. Um, and they feel more realistic, and it's a lot more fun when Aragon is interacting with them than when the Fellowship was interacting with elves. Because, like, in the Fellowship of the Ring book, it's just kind of, well, they were there with the elves and they all sang and they ate delicious food and it was wonderful and everybody had a great time and that's it, the end. And the Aragon story, it's like, oh, he's got a crush on Arya, but she's 100 years old, and everybody notices, and he keeps trying to like have small talk with her because he's falling in love with her, and everybody's like, Aragon, you gotta leave her alone, you incel. um, and the elves are proud, which is a huge flaw of theirs. And it's actually incredible that some of them are hundreds of years old or whatever, and they still have something as basic as pride, um, and they don't really they live in seclusion more than even Lord of the Rings elves, and they have all their weird traditions. But just seeing the characters interact with the elves in the inheritance cycle is more interesting because it's not just told to you with like a narration, but the characters will get into some sort of dialogue about something, and then they'll have these emotions that come out. The dwarves might get irritated at the elves, or somebody might get embarrassed about something or whatever. Um, and the elves are, um, they're not perfect like they are in the Lord of the Rings. Um, they're just almost perfect, which makes them more interesting than them just being completely perfect. And I mean, only it's not like they're actually perfect in Lord of the Rings. I'm just using a word here. Um, yeah. Uh, Reading the book. So, I guess this series, The Inheritance Cycle, was started when the author was 16, I believe, is what I heard. When he was a teenager, anyway. And the thing is, I think that when people hear that and then they start to critically analyze the book, they'll blame like any shortcoming um, on, on him being 16, and they'll just have harsher criticisms, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, you can really tell the author was young when he wrote this." But the thing is, a lot of the things in the book are a lot more mature and well written than like grown adults that you will read. I mean, it's a really good series. You can't even call it mediocre. It's a very decent series. Um, it's not. I wouldn't say it's overrated. I would even say it's underrated. Probably because it didn't get a good movie or a good show. And it's just kind of one of those things that's I don't really hear anybody talk about it, but I mean it's so good. I mean, I don't. It's kind of sad that I guess it's kind of just one of those things. It's gotten older, so it doesn't have as much of a fan base anymore. But I guess it's just odd that some things um, keep existing and then other things don't, and they just fade out of memory, I guess. Because I don't ever hear anybody talk about the inheritance cycle, but I don't know. I guess maybe it's just good, but it's not great. But then why isn't it great? What makes something great or not? Because, I read it and it stuck with me all these years. I always would occasionally remember it whenever I thought about fantasy. And I like the magic system. And I always remembered the elves and the way that Aragon interacted with Arya. And I remembered Roran's story. He was one of my favorite characters. Um, and just it's strange to me that something this decent can just disappear out of the consciousness of these spaces where people talk about fantasy and books and stuff like that. But I guess maybe I have to look up the inheritance cycle subreddit or something. Something I will say that is that the How to Train Your Dragon book series does dragons better. Well, that's not exactly what I meant to say, but just that the character of Toothless in the How to Train Your Dragon, specifically the book series, because the movies are a downgrade um, by a lot, and people just don't understand if they haven't read the books. Um, the character of Toothless, he talks and everything in the books, and he's small. He's like cat sized instead of being a big dumb dragon. Um, his character is a lot better than any fictional dragon that I can think of. Um, I would even say that Toothless in the books of How to Train Your Dragon is better than like Parthenax in Skyrim. Um, that's just my opinion. You just have to I guess read the books if you want to know what his character is like. He's kind of a brat, um, but he loves the character Hiccup, who's his I guess his owner, even though he wouldn't like that to be said. And he's proud, but he's kind of dumb, and he's a glutton. It's just he's funny, and he's cute, and he's a little bit rotten and bad, but at the end of the day, he does have a heart somewhere in there, and he's just a funny and interesting character. Better than probably my favorite dragon in fiction is Toothless in the How to Train Your Dragon series, the book. And just in comparison, Saphira really isn't very interesting. In fact, she's like the most boring character in the whole Inheritance Cycle series so far. Like 1.5 books in, and I never really remembered her character too much. I remembered her being, she's just kind of proud and she's smarter than Aragon, and she acts like a dragon. Where I remember there's like one point where she meets an older dragon and she basically gets in heat and starts acting like a female cat or something. um, and that's pretty much the most interesting thing that Saphira does. But other than that, she's kind of typical, um, just kind of normal, like basically what you would expect, a basic female dragon to act like. I don't know. Um, even like Smaug from The Hobbit is more interesting than Saphira, I think. Even though he's not even there most of the time. Um, but yeah, it's a shame though, because I mean she's on the cover of the book, and I don't even really remember um, any of the other dragons in the series, but there are other dragons in the series. Um, and it's too bad because in the books they act like the characters will sometimes say, dragons are equal to humans, or they're on their level, but it doesn't really seem like it's like you can tell the author didn't really believe that. And it's also kind of like it's like how dwarves and elves aren't really they're not really real characters, which is why they're never the main characters in these stories. Even in Lord of the Rings, the elves and dwarves they're an other. They're not the character. They're something else because you have the hobbits, and the hobbits are basically taking place of the humans in the story. Um, of like just an ordinary person. Um, yeah. I thought that was interesting. I was thinking about that yesterday, just how, because I don't think I've ever read a fantasy book where the main character was a dwarf or an elf, um, which is interesting. Um, and I don't really know why, come to think of it, because it sounds like that would be fun to read something where it was about a dwarf and a bunch of other dwarves, or about an elf and a bunch of other elves. But instead, they're put underground, or they're put in a forest somewhere off in the distance, um, which they still could be. It's just I don't know. Like we have this sense of you put these fantasy races to the side because the humans are the important ones, which maybe there's nothing wrong with. Humans are God's creation, so maybe we're just acknowledging that in a subtle way. I'm not sure. Because, elves and dwarves, I guess, are our creation, I guess, you know? Or or are they also God's creation? I don't know. But humans are the special ones. We're the main characters. Just gonna add something here because I don't have enough to say to make a video about it. But Lego Ninjago was high art, and it was a really good series. Um, and it's good to see it get recognition on the internet because it's just kind of amazing that something that was obviously maybe not entirely conceived out of corporate greed, but when you think about it, it's a show that was made for kids so that their parents would have to buy them Lego sets, right? But the actual artists that made the show, like the people that wrote it, made actual art, and it's good, and there's lessons in it. And the characters act like family, and it's wholesome. So I just wanted to say that, you know. And probably my favorite lesson in there was when Lloyd said, he learned from his comic books, fair, fair isn't a word where I come from. And that's really good to keep in mind, I think.